Witchcraft movies often reach cult status. We're talking The Craft and Practical Magic, but some of them fly under the radar. And today we're talking about a movie I had never heard of before some of you recommended it to me. This is what the Love Witch got right about witchcraft and especially Wicca. In 2016, The Love Witch was released. It is a comedy horror that is set in the 1960s, and it's probably not going to be for everyone. If you haven't seen the movie, but you're on social media, it's quite likely that you've heard some of the audio from the movie, especially this bit.
The day he left me was the day that I died. Then I was reborn as a witch.
Now, the movie is not going to be for everyone. It's so weird you can't look away. It's that kind of a film. But whilst I was watching it, I realised it contained so much information about witchcraft and especially 1960s Wicca, which is so unusual to find in a modern movie, and so I knew I had to talk about it. Now, I'm not affiliated with these movies or the people that produce them in any way, shape or form. I'm just really passionate about witchcraft, and I want to share additional information for anyone who would like to know where the information in these movies comes from. So I would recommend watching The Love Witch before you watch this video because it will contain spoilers. And just to let people know, I wouldn't recommend the movie to anyone at least below the age of 16, maybe even below the age of 18. It's going to depend on where you are around the world because it does contain some sensitive topics, sexual scenes, as well as violence and gore. So I just want to let you know, but I'm going to be trying to avoid showing any of that, or at least as much as possible in this video, just so it's more approachable for everyone. And with that being said, whilst I'm all dressed up like the main character Elaine, let's talk about the Love Witch. Our story today revolves around Elaine, a love witch on her pursuit for a fantasy fairy tale love. And everything that happens next is the chaos from her single-minded desire to achieve her goals. And it really is chaos. The magical references start from the very first scene, where we see Elaine driving in her car and she's rummaging through her bag. And while she's rummaging, a deck of tarot cards falls out. And we see at the very top of that deck is the Three of Swords. And this card is going to appear time and time again throughout this movie. Now, the Rider-Waite-Smith deck is actually one I have in my own collection. I actually keep it in a box like this. And it's probably one of the most famous tarot decks in the entire world. You're going to find lots of different varieties. This is just the one that I have. And the cards are really, really beautiful. Now, I do read reversals, so some of them are upright and some of them are reversed. And it's gone on to become the basis of the majority of tarot decks available today. Now, certainly not all, but it is one of the most popular systems, and the majority of tarot books are actually based on this system. Initially, the deck was published in 1909 by the Rider Company under the instruction of A.E. Waite, and the artwork was actually created by Pamela Colman Smith, hence the name Rider-Waite-Smith Tarot, and it's still being published in many different editions to this day. And both Arthur Edward Waite, A.E. Waite, and Pamela Colman Smith were members of the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn, and we're going to see kind of echoes of these earlier very popular traditions throughout the entirety of this movie. But the particular card that came up is this one. Now, the Three of Swords is commonly known as the Heartbreak card. It's seen as a card of emotional distress, emotional turmoil. If you're in some kind of a relationship, whether that is a romantic relationship, whether that is a familial relationship or a platonic relationship with your friends, then this kind of card can mean that there are bumps coming in the road. It doesn't necessarily mean that you're about to get your heart broken, but it definitely is an option. And so this card making such a significant appearance throughout the entirety of this movie really tells you where Elaine's love life is going to go. We then come to the first flashback of Elaine's Wiccan initiation, and that's definitely what this is. I've rewatched these scenes so many times, pausing it, looking at all of the details, and it seems like they've done a lot of research, specifically on earlier, more traditional forms of Wicca. Now, I'm going to start this by saying that Wicca now is very different to how Wicca was in the 1960s. Many of the branches of Wicca still remain, but there are many, many more. And you don't necessarily need the same degree of ceremony, the same degree of ritual magic. You don't necessarily need covens or initiations. It is significantly different. So for the purpose of this video, we are going to primarily be talking about Wicca as it was seen in the 1960s. So we're mostly looking at Gardnerian and Alexandrian Wicca. Now, of course, they have adapted and and changed things for the purpose of the movie, so it's hard to tell whether this is Alexandrian or Gardnerian, though I am leaning a little bit more towards Gardnerian. I will talk about that in a minute though. This kind of initiation is done at the very start of your journey into Wicca. This is where you are being initiated into the tradition. Now there are 3 stages or levels to your journey within Wicca. You would have an initiation that leads to your first degree, you then have the second degree and the third degree, and they are performed by very specific people. So if you are being initially initiated, well, that's a tongue twister, you would always be done so by a second or third degree initiate. You would very rarely be initiated by someone who is a first degree initiate. It's often done in a coven environment, in a ritual setup just like this. And the way they've set this up to me really shows that they've done their research, and it's likely they've taken their ritual and adapted it from a pre-existing work. This could have been the works of Doreen Valiente, but I'm actually leaning more towards the works of Janet and Stuart Farrar from their book, The Witch's Bible. This is a dense one. It covers a lot of the ceremonies that are seen within this movie, particularly initiations. You also have the different Sabbath celebrations, you have Wiccanings, hand fastings and the like, some of which do make an appearance in this movie, and this is all information from a working Wiccan coven, so it would make sense that they would use this as a reference. I will leave more information about this in the description box if you are interested in learning more about this particular style of Wicca. So this is a coven environment, and an initiation takes place as a way of both initiating you into the religion of Wicca, but also initiating you into the secrets and the privacy of that coven group. There are many things within Wiccan covens that are oath-bound, and so only members of that coven are able to know that information. These might be the specific names of deities, these might be the specific rituals that are being done. They are not allowed to be shared with anyone outside of those traditions as a way of preserving traditions and also as a way of keeping them safe. It's important to remember that the Witchcraft Act in England was only repealed in the very early 1950s, and we had a really big increase in the popularity of witchcraft and Wicca during the 60s and 70s, but that didn't necessarily mean that the stigma or taboo around this topic was gone. So a lot of privacy and discretion was often used by those who followed these faiths as a way of keeping themselves safe. Now, within an initiation, as I already mentioned, you'd usually be initiated by someone who is of a higher degree than you, second or third. In this case, it appears we have the priest in the purple on the right, and we have the high priestess in the red on the left. Now, within this particular time frame, we see a lot of duality. And so I think it's really important to bear in mind the time period that this is taking place in. This is based off tradition in the 1960s, 70s, even into the 80s. It started changing a little bit when we get to the 90s. There was a lot of duality, a lot of masculine, feminine, God, goddess, a lot of binary that doesn't necessarily apply in the same way today, so just do bear that in mind. If you were a woman, you were typically initiated by a man. If you were a man, you were typically initiated by a woman. The main exemptions for this were if you were initiating a family member, so a mother could initiate a daughter or a father could initiate a son and the like. And so we have the entire coven gathered around here. They're all watching this take place. It's a ritual, so the entire group is commonly involved. And while the priest and priestess are wearing ritual clothes, these are robes that are specifically tailored for them, specifically designed. And we will see also headgear later on that is pretty common. We see this being used a lot by Gerald Gardner within his rituals. I believe that the actual headgear that Gerald Gardner actually wore is now seen in a museum. I will have to double check, but anyway, we'll get onto that later. The rest of the coven is actually skyclad bar their cloaks. Now, skyclad is naked. You're doing your rituals in the buff, basically. This is something that was really commonplace. I have performed rituals skyclad before, but it isn't something that you have to do. They can be just as powerful wearing clothes. I've found great success both ways. It just depends on what you feel comfortable with. A lot of covens now will not carry this out because it does lead to potential issues. I'm sure some of you will know what I mean. But for this particular time period, them being skyclad makes a lot of sense. It is a deeper connection to the divine, to the energy of all around. You are removing all of your associations with class or money or rank in the world, and instead you're reducing yourself down to being nothing more than your physical being, deeply connected with the spirituality and the world around you. Now, Elaine in this situation is in the nude, mostly obviously for the purpose of the movie. They have covered some stuff up. She is blindfolded and her hands are tied behind her back. Now, this is typically done with a red cord or red thread, and we can actually see her ankles have been bound with a red thread. Her wrists, however, have been bound in blue, which is why I believe this is actually Gardnerian instead of Alexandrian, because commonly red, white and blue cords were used in initiations, at least as far as I can remember, whereas with Alexandrian it's primarily just red. Now, I am not super well versed in Alexandrian. Do let me know if you do know more on this topic. And this is all taking place within a ritual circle. Now, I spent 2 years, I was meant to do this video 2 years ago, trying to research where this ritual circle comes from. So I suspect that this is probably kind of an amalgamation of multiple different ritual circles brought together, but generally speaking, an initiation would be carried out in some kind of circle. This could be a ceremonial circle, this could be a circle that has been delineated, this could be a marked circle or an unmarked circle, but within that circle, it is essentially sacred space. Now, we can see that around the edge of that circle, I'm not sure if we can see any of the other candles, there's at least one candle, and we see this repeated throughout this movie. We have the different colours of candles to represent the different elements which mark out the different quarters within that ceremonial circle. So here we can see the red candle, which would be used to represent the direction south as well as the element of fire, and it's quite likely that around the perhaps quarter point, so north, south, east, west, perhaps they're actually on all of the points of the pentacle. It's quite likely that there will have been another candle there, it's just we can't see it in this particular scene. And then we can also see there is an altar in the background. Altars are spaces where rituals are commonly taken place. Ritual items are commonly placed there. You will also find libations like wine and food also been placed there to be given as gifts to the god and the goddess within the Wiccan tradition. Every coven is going to have a different group of deities. There are named deities within this book as an example, but there would be certain covens where their deities would be oath-bound. So if you were not privy to that information, you were not told that information, they would just be referred to as the god and the goddess. Some covens would simply work with these archetypal energies. Sometimes it would be multiple different deities, sometimes it would just be a god and a goddess, just singular, and they would be named to the members of that coven. Are we confused yet? Because there's a lot. I'm trying to not overwhelm all in one go, so we will move on to the next scene, but as you can see, there's a lot going into this. Now, we're going to be elaborating more on this ritual later when we start seeing more of it, but this to me really sets the scene for how much research they've done, especially within Wicca, and I actually think they've done more research on the Wiccan ritual side of this than they do the witchcraft, but we'll get to that later. Now, the next bit, I'm not sure if it's actually going to be significant or if they even were aware that they were doing it at all, but it's definitely something that might interest some of you. This might not even make it into the final cut, we'll see. But throughout the movie, she wears a lot of rings, and ring placement is often really significant within witchcraft. You'll see a lot of practitioners will wear certain stones on certain fingers in certain metals, because each of your fingers is related to different energies, and you can work with this within subtle spell work and ritual. So this doesn't apply to everyone in every circumstance, but the left hand is usually receiving and the right hand is usually giving. So if you wanted to give love to other people or the people you came in contact with, you might want to be wearing rose quartz on your right hand. Whereas if you wanted to receive love, you might want to be wearing rose quartz on your left hand. Within this movie, Elaine primarily seems to have rings on her pointer and middle finger on her left hand. These are associated with Jupiter and Saturn, Jupiter being the pointer finger and Saturn being the middle finger. Now, I've got it all written down here, that's why I'm looking down, because there's a lot of information that I wrote for this. The pointer finger, Jupiter, is usually associated with the water element and is connected with good luck, opportunities, and abundance. Saturn, the middle finger, is associated with the earth element and is typically associated with authority, power, and self-discipline, as well as wisdom and eternity. And so I don't know if it was a purposeful choice, but it is something just to note, perhaps, if you are interested in more subtle everyday forms of magic. Using rings and jewelry can be really important for that, as well as using certain fingers. If you would like, I can do an entire video on rings and finger meanings and all that, if that's something that you are interested in. Also, side note, the house is gorgeous. It's giving practical magic, but with a goth twist. And I gotta say, I love it. It's not quite as nice as the practical magic house, but it's it's definitely up there. We can then see colour being a really significant feature in this movie. Now, colour is very deeply connected to witchcraft and to magic. It's used a lot within Wicca as well. And red is very much Elaine's colour. Her nails are red. Her heart-shaped keychain is red. Her luggage is red. Her car is red. Her clothes are red. Everything is red. She's got a real thing for it. And you'll actually see this colour appearing throughout the entire movie. So all of the candles in the flat are red. It just repeats everywhere in the movie is red. And red is very much a colour of passion, of love, of romance, of lust, but also of anger and violence and frustration. And all of that is really going to come through within this movie. Now, when it comes to witchcraft, you don't have to use coloured candles or colour representation, but it can be a really powerful addition. So if you were going to be doing a love spell, you might want to be using a red candle. If you were working with colour magic, generally you might want to wear red, you might want to paint your nails red, wear red lipstick and the like. It's quite significant for a lot of practitioners. If it's not accessible for you though, you can use white instead, as that's perceived as being a universal colour. Now, the apartment is really interesting. I'm not going to talk too much about it throughout the movie, I'm just going to focus on it here. There's a lot going on. So the lady who's showing her the apartment, I believe her name is Trish, I think. I'm not very good with names. I'm going to go with Trish and we're going to hope it's right. She describes the apartment as being a bit garish. Now, she's an interior decorator, and she said that she based the colour scheme off the Thoth tarot deck. Now, the Thoth is very deeply associated with Aleister Crowley. I'm hoping I'm saying that right. It is written as Thoth, and I've had many people say to me Thoth. I've had many people say to me Thoth. I'm honestly not entirely sure. Let me know what the actual pronunciation is so that I know going forwards, because I'm a reader. Right, I'm a reader, I'm not so much of a people-y person, so if I pronounce things wrong, it's usually because I pronounced it wrong in my head once, and then that's just the way I've pronounced it. Forever, it's a problem. Any of you who are also avid readers will know. Pronunciation gets difficult in the real world if we've never heard anyone else say it. Now, the Thoth tarot deck is very deeply associated with Aleister Crowley. He's a very divisive figure. Some people absolutely adore his work and believe him to be a genius. Other people can't stand him. But I do think that the inclusion of this Thoth colour scheme is really significant, especially for the time period. Now, Thoth is actually an ancient Egyptian deity associated with the moon, knowledge, magic, writing, hieroglyphics, and art, among many other things, and is very significant in belief systems and spirituality surrounding this time period. And the colour scheme of this apartment it's garish. It is very garish. It is bright oranges and teals and yellows, and there's artwork all over the walls which represents different phases of the goddess. So we have the triple moon in one section, we have different tarot cards, so we have the Wheel of Fortune on a different wall. There's a lot going on, as well as a lot of red candles and a massive altar space. Now, Barbara, the actual owner of the apartment, is the high priestess of Elaine's coven. And this interior decorator described her as being, quote, into all that Wiccan stuff. And it is gorgeous. I mean, there's an entire section that is literally an altar space. It's like an alcove with a big altar table in the center with walls of books and herbs, and candles are burning, and it is actually beautiful. It is garish, it's brightly coloured, but there's something about it that is just so whimsical and magical. Now, an altar space within Wicca is used a little bit differently to how we see altar spaces used within witchcraft. There's often a very set layout to altar spaces. You would have a god representation on one side, a goddess on the other. You would have a wand and an athame. You'd probably also have a scourge and a pentacle. You're going to have certain candles. It's laid out very ritually, whereas within witchcraft, we see it being a lot more free-flowing. There may well also be altars that would be more akin to shrines, where you would be working specifically with the god and the goddess. Sometimes they would be together, sometimes they would be separate. It really is going to depend on the individual tradition. And I think that's really important for me to emphasize here, is that while during this time period we see primary groups of tradition appearing, there was definitely variation from those. So the workings that you would see by Janet and Stuart Farrar, for instance, are their workings from their working coven. That doesn't mean that a coven, a village, or a town over, or in a different county performed the exact same rituals. These are just the rituals from this particular coven, and you would see different groups and even different members of the same group doing things in a slightly different way. There was still variation, there was just less variation than we see today when there's now thousands of different varieties of Wicca. We then get to the line that is probably the most famous. I mentioned it earlier very briefly, where Elaine says, "The day he left me was the day I died. Then I was reborn as a witch." And she continues to say that Barbara and Dan, the high priest and priestess, brought me back to life. They taught me everything I know about magic. And this is pretty common for the time period. We have to remember that while today we can go onto YouTube, we can go onto Amazon or into Barnes & Noble or into Waterstones if you're in England, and you can buy a book on witchcraft. They're commonplace, they're accessible. This wasn't the case during this time, and it certainly wasn't till probably the mid-80s we start seeing more books being published and more interaction. Now, there of course were books on the subject, but especially if we're talking the early 60s, some of the only books that had been published were by Gerald Gardner, and they were fiction novels with witchcraft and Wicca involved within them. A good example would be High Magic's Aid, which was Gerald Gardner's first book on the topic. He wasn't permitted by his coven to publish a legitimate book of the rituals in that coven. Instead, they were under the guise of it being a fantasy novel. And so it's a really small book. I do have a copy of it in my collection, and it is a lot of Wiccan ritual under the guise of fantasy. And that was what a lot of people were going off. You could really only learn if you knew someone who was a part of that tradition. And even if you knew someone who was a part of that tradition, if they were oath-bound, they weren't able to tell you the ins and outs of ritual. You had to be initiated. Now, sometimes this initiation happens straight away. Sometimes, as we see it today, it happens after a year and a day. But you weren't typically allowed to know the information from within that coven before that point. And so a lot of people learned solely from their elders in that coven. That doesn't necessarily mean people who were older than you, but people who were more experienced than you. Your higher-ups, those that were a little bit more learned in that coven, were your only source of information. So this kind of language actually isn't that unusual, because this initiation ceremony very much was considered to be a rebirth. You were being reborn into this new tradition. And so the wording of, "and then I was reborn as a witch," is actually really fitting for the time period. And then we get the second flashback to that initiation ritual. Now here I really want to be focusing on this sword that is being placed to Elaine's chest. Now the sword within Wiccan tradition is seen as an alternative to an athame being a ritual knife. Now within Wicca, this was typically a double-edged, black-handled knife, and for most covens, every individual would have their own. So it wouldn't necessarily be that there was one athame for that entire coven. Everyone would have their own individual athame, and then there would be one sword for ritual purposes, and the sword was an alternation of the athame. Now these are typically used to represent the air element, though some people do use them to work with the fire element, and they're used largely within ceremony. So they aren't used to physically cut anything. Everything is more ceremonial in nature. But this is different to how blades and athames are used within witchcraft, where commonly they are practical tools. So within kitchen witchcraft, you might be using your kitchen knife as your athame. You might, if you're a green witch, be using your athame to trim plants and to take cuttings. It's important to remember that there are the same terms used across different traditions. So within these forms of Wicca, so we're talking traditional British Wicca, we're talking Gardnerian, we're talking Alexandrian, this style of Wicca, the athame and the sword were not used in a physical sense. They were used in a ritual sense, ceremonial, energetic in nature. Now the sword or athame point is placed towards the chest. It doesn't have to be touching, it's usually just placed in the direction and vicinity of. And then whoever is carrying out that initiation, whether it be a high priest or a high priestess or another member of that coven, would say something along these lines. "For I say verily, it were better to rush upon thy blade and perish, than make an attempt with fear in thy heart." And the one being initiated would follow up and say, "I have 2 passwords, perfect love and perfect trust," and then that blade is then lowered. We see a very similar thing taking place in the movie The Craft, though that was done with an athame rather than a sword, and it was a slightly different setting, less ceremonial in nature, but we do see a similar thing taking place again and again and again. Now within this scene, we also see an athame being rather violently dunked into a chalice. Now this is done within ceremony, though nowhere near as violently as this. This is like damage levels of force. These tools are very expensive, especially when we didn't see mass production, especially if we're going to artisan creators. Athames are very, very expensive even now, even more so in the 60s, and a really good chalice was hard to come by, so you didn't want to damage them. This motion, the sinking of the athame into the chalice, was used as a representation of the divine union, the great rite, the bonding of male and female. Are you getting what I'm putting down here? The athame is very phallic in nature, it's very masculine in nature, and the cup is considered to be akin to the womb, and so it is very feminine in nature. As we can see, during this time, and even now, many aspects of Wicca are very binary in nature, and that wouldn't necessarily make everyone feel comfortable today, so it is really important to perceive this in the time period that this took place. This is usually done a lot more gently. It's designed to be a representation of that union. It's not designed to be a threatening or aggressive thing at all. And sometimes the athame is actually dipped into the chalice while it contains liquid. This could be for the purposes of consecration. This could just be liquids like wine or mead or grape juice, something like that, as a representational thing. We then see the five-fold kiss being performed, and this was really that moment where I went, oh, they're going like really intense on the Wiccan lore here. Like, this is something that you don't typically see. And while some covens still perform this to this day, it definitely isn't something that's seen regularly among modern Wiccans, and I suspect that a lot of people who follow a very modern branch of Wicca have maybe never even heard of this. Now, the five-fold kiss is done within ceremony. It is usually carried out within a circle. It can be performed by a man on a woman or a woman on a man, depending on the context of that ritual or ceremony. In this particular setting, it is being done by the high priest on the new initiate, Elaine. Now, this kiss is done in set ways, and set things are said at the same time. Now, technically, it's more than 5 places that are being kissed, but they're doubling up, and you'll see what I mean. So you would start at the feet and you would work up. So you would kiss one foot and then the other, one kneecap, then the other, just above the pubic bone, one breast, and then the other, and then on the lips. And as this was being carried out, different wording was said, depending on whether this was being performed on a woman or whether this was being performed on a man. So the 2 examples we have for this. So for a five-fold kiss being performed on a woman, the wording would go as follows. Blessed be thy feet, they have brought thee in thy ways. Blessed be thy knees, that shall kneel at the sacred altar. Blessed be thy womb, without which we would not be. Blessed be thy breasts, formed in beauty. Blessed be thy lips, that shall utter the sacred names. If this was to be performed on the man, the wording is slightly different. Blessed be thy feet, they have brought thee in thy ways. Blessed be thy knees, that shall kneel at the sacred altar. Blessed be thy phallus, without which we would not be. Blessed be thy breast, formed in strength. Blessed be thy lips that shall utter the sacred names. Now, this is not typically done as like a standalone thing. It would be part of a much bigger ritual, but it just isn't done the same now as it was before, and I'm sure that many of you will be able to recognise why. Wicca during this time period was very comfortable with mentions of sex, with nudity and the like. That isn't necessarily the same now. Not everyone's going to feel comfortable with this, and for the most part, unless you are part of a particular coven that very much follows the earlier ways of Wicca, this kind of thing just isn't done the same, which is what makes me actually really like the fact that they included it in the movie, because if they'd have included a modern form of Wicca in a movie that's meant to be set in the 1960s, it would completely throw off the theme entirely. We then come to a scene where Elaine is making up magical items that are going to be sold in an occult shop. Now, we'll get to the shop in a moment. The items that she's using, though, are used within witchcraft to this day. So initially we see her creating spell bags. These are purple bags with a pentacle stitched into the front of it, and into each bag she is putting a series of different herbs. Now, I actually went through and I paused it so many times, I managed to figure out what most of the herbs in the movie are. So inside this bag, it appears to be for dream magic or astral or psychic work. So we have mugwort, which is for dream magic, astral projection, psychic development, as well as lavender, which is used for healing, sleep magic, dream magic, astral work, and psychic development. So it appears that whatever pouch is being created here is specifically designed for psychic growth and development or dream magic. These kind of bags are used really commonly. They can be carried around, they can be kept in a car, they can be kept under your bed. If it was for something like dream magic or psychic development, you might want to fill this pouch with mugwort, with lavender. You might want to include some rainbow moonstone or some labradorite in there, some clear quartz. A petition can be added in, and then that can be placed under your pillow or under your bed to help magnify that energy while you are asleep. Specifically for psychic development, you can always use this while doing tarot reading and other kinds of divination as a way of adding that energy into that space. I apologize if throughout all of this I'm talking really, really quickly. I know how much I'm going to have to fit into this video. And so I'm just trying to get through it as quickly as possible. If you need to, you can slow me down. YouTube does have an option where you can change the speed so you can make me talk quicker, or you can make me talk slower, whatever it is that you need at that given time. Now, the pentacle on the front of this, I'm sure many of you are already aware, is a 5-pointed star within a circle. Now, if it were a pentagram, it would either be inverted or it would be a 5-pointed star without a circle. Now, a pentacle is used as a representation for all of the elements. So you have earth, air, fire, water, and spirit. It's also seen as a protection symbol, a symbol that represents manifestation, goals, witchcraft, magic, and paganism, and it's been used by many different cultures and traditions around the world, including Christianity. It always shocks people when they hear that the pentacle and pentagram were one of the many symbols that Christianity has picked up and dropped along the way. Now it is considered to be a really common symbol among pagans, witches, and Wiccans as a way of representing themselves to other practitioners, as well as a powerful symbol within spells and rituals. During the scene, she is also creating magical dolls. These are also known as poppets and fifth faths. They're used for many different practices. Many people do truly believe that these dolls are only used in cursing, but they aren't. They're used as representation for an individual. That could be yourself, that could be someone else. It allows you to do remote work from a distance so that if someone is traveling, you're still able to keep them safe. Or if someone needs healing but they aren't able to get to you, you're able to work with that doll as a representation for them. These dolls act as a link between you and the person in question, so the workings that you're carrying out on that doll are going to be trickling into the spiritual world and then trickling into the physical world within that person's life. They're incredibly useful, super duper versatile, and they have a massively bad reputation, and that's why I think it's really important to talk about it and say that these aren't bad, because even to this day, when someone who is not part of witchcraft sees a doll, they immediately think cursing, and that just isn't true. It can be true, but it doesn't have to be true. There's a difference. We also see different candles being made in different colours. Now, this is something that I actually do for my own business. We make specific candles that are used for ritual practice. Candle magic is one of the most popular around the world because it is so visual, it's so appealing, it's very tactile, and it's also really useful if you do struggle with your energy work, or maybe you want something physical to ground your practice. Candle magic is really, really effective for that. She's also making ritual soap as well, all of which is going to be sold at the local occult shop or apothecary. Now, we do see a Book of Shadows on this table, and I'm going to say that this is specifically a Book of Shadows because this has very clearly been written by Elaine. Now, I know I go over this in every single one of these videos, so I will make it brief. There is a difference between a Book of Shadows and a grimoire, even though I do know that now people typically use the terms interchangeably. Both are books that describe magical practice, but a grimoire is a book that has been written for the purpose of someone else reading it. So, this, for instance, that I've had on my lap this entire time, this book would be considered a grimoire, whereas a book that has been created by a practitioner for themselves would be considered a Book of Shadows. It's more akin to a magical diary, a magical journal. It tracks your progress, your workings, the alterations and changes that you are making. And covens will also have these as well. So you would have a coven Book of Shadows where the individuals of that coven would be documenting their practice, and they would then be going back to previous workings to redo them again at a later point. It would then become a grimoire if that Book of Shadows was then published for the general public. That then becomes a grimoire. But in this, Elaine has definitely written these spells herself. Everything is hand done by her. We do see this repeating later, so this would be considered a Book of Shadows. And some of the information on this is definitely taken from legitimate practice. I'm not sure about some of it, so I did pause some of them. So we have one page that says Liber al vel legis, which translates from Latin as the Book of Law. And it says the following: every man and every woman is a star. Do what thou will shall be the whole of the law. Love is the law, love under will. Thou hast no right but to do thy will. Belief in the power of self, of partnership between the sexes. Every man and woman is a star. Now, I have looked this up. I can't find any documentation of this anywhere else. I suspect that this particular page was was created specifically for the movie. However, we do have another page in here which is called the Witch's Chant, which is followed by an altar setup, and it does include a very basic Wiccan altar setup where we have different sections for the god and the goddess. We have a chalice, a pentacle, a bowl, a cauldron, a wand, a god and a goddess figure, candles, the classic setup of a Wiccan altar. So it definitely is a combination of lots of different things. We've got some things that are real, some things that aren't, and I actually think that that is the best way of doing it, to ground it into real world practice without running the risk of anything strange happening. Because we did see this when they were filming the original Craft movie in the 90s. Strange things were happening because a lot of the workings that they were doing were word for word accurate. And the problem with that is if you don't know what you're doing and you don't know how to deal with it, you can end up dealing with things that you would never normally have to deal with. So here we have quite a combination of real and not real. You're running through the motions without putting any of the energy into it. You're running through the motions without any of the words. It stops some of the weird stuff from happening. And we can see as we go on through this, lots of things have been altered to make it slightly less than accurate, probably for the purpose of not having anything strange happen. Now we then see Elaine mixing up a love potion. Now, love potions are used. There are many different areas around the world where love potions are actually consumed, though, as we will see later, I wouldn't necessarily recommend giving anyone something without their consent, especially if you don't know how they're going to react to it. It can be incredibly dangerous, but this is a really core part of many different traditions around the world. This love potion in particular, though, is incredibly dangerous, and so I'm a little surprised that all of the ingredients were added in. So the page that we actually see says, to attract a lover to you, mix the following together with a mortar and pestle: juniper berries, henbane, rose petals, elderflowers, vervain, and dittany of Crete. Add the herb mixture to red wine and boil in a pot. I'm assuming that you would then be expected to strain it on the other end. Now, a lot of these things are used for love in certain ways. I wouldn't personally be using these herbs for these things. Henbane is very, very dangerous to be working with. You don't want to be consuming it in any way, shape, or form. But just to kind of throw my own kind of 2 cents in here, I'm actually going to go through a book like this. This is Scott Cunningham's Encyclopedia of Magical Herbs, to get up the full range of different intentions for all of these herbs. Because I work with them in very, very set ways, and I'll let you know how I personally work with them. But I wanted to cover kind of a general basis by using a book like this. There's lots of options out there. This is just my favourite. You can see how battered this is. It's meant to all be this colour, this green and yellow, but mine is very, very faded. Let's start with juniper berries. Now for me, juniper is commonly used for protection, especially the berries, and I also use them in love workings as well. But for more context, Scott Cunningham says the following: used throughout Europe as a protective herb, juniper also guards against theft. It was probably one of the earliest incenses used by Mediterranean witches. Juniper, hung at the door, protects against evil forces and persons, and it is burned in exorcism rites. A sprig of the plant protects its wearer against accidents and attacks by wild animals. It also guards against ghosts and sicknesses. Juniper is also added to love mixtures, and the berries are carried to increase male potency. When carried or burned, juniper helps with psychic powers and breaks hexes and curses, as well as driving off snakes. So that is specifically juniper. We then move on to henbane. Now for me, henbane would always be used in malefic workings because it is very poisonous, but that is going to vary person to person. There are many people out there who work actively with poisonous plants in a variety of different ways. And Scott Cunningham specifically says, another poisonous plant largely ignored in herb magic today due to its toxicity. Henbane is still sometimes utilised as a love-bringing herb in the following manner. To bring love, a man should gather henbane naked early in the morning while standing on one foot. Worn, it will bring love. Burned out of doors, it attracts rain, but the fumes would be poisonous. You can substitute for fern in its usage. So what I'm thinking here is that they probably have got a book exactly like this. And actually, it wouldn't surprise me if they got exactly this book, because this is one of the most famous for this particular topic anyway. And they've gone through and they've just looked at plants that relate to love. So I will actually check, because at the back of this book, they have an entire section where you can look for specific intentions. Let's have a look what we have for love. Love, divinations of, longevity, love, to attract. And all of these plants, all of these are used for love. And in there, no doubt, all of the ones in this working will be. Now, rose petals are another one that I would very much use for love. For me, it's going to depend on the colour and also the shape of it. Are they petals? Are they buds? For me, yellow is all about friendship. White is all about peace. You would have pink, all about friendship and new growth, new love, platonic relationships. Buds are more about the starting of something. A red rose is all about love and passion and lust and deep, intense romance, marriage. It very much depends on the colour and the type, but they can be used for lots of other workings as well. So you can use them in workings that relate to the full moon. A white rose in representation of the full moon is really useful. They can be used in abundance workings, prosperity workings, developing new things. Rose is really, really versatile. But in this book, it does say that roses have long been used in love mixtures, owing to the flower's associations with emotions. A chaplet of roses worn when performing love spells, but remove the thorns, or a single rose in a vase on an altar are powerful love magic. Rose water diluted from the petals can be added into love baths. Rose hips can be dried, strung, and worn to attract love as beads. The tea of rosebuds can be drunk before sleep for prophetic dreams, and it goes on and on and on. I will say, though, that rose thorns are also very good in protection and baneful workings as well, so it's one of those plants that can flip one way and the other. We then move on to elder. Now, elder is something that you may well also have drunk in the form of elderflower syrup, elderflower cordial, elderflower tea, anything like that. Elderberry jam is another one. And they're also really useful in magic. Now, elder is an incredibly potent tree. Considered to be a mother among trees, her energy is so potent that many practitioners will refuse to take any wood of the elder because they don't want to disturb her in any way, shape, or form. However, the flowers and berries can be taken with permission. They're commonly used for exorcism, protection, healing, prosperity, and sleep. There's not so much about love in here, but there is a section about weddings where it says elder is used at weddings to bring good luck to the couple, and pregnant women kiss the tree for good fortune for the coming baby. So it might have a relation to that kind of longevity of relationships. Elaine is after something that is very, very long term. We then move on to vervain. Vervain that found fame with the Vampire Diaries as a form of protection, and that is generally what vervain is most commonly used for. It is a plant of protection, but it can also be used for love as well. So Scott Cunningham says that vervain is traditionally gathered at midsummer or at the rising of the dog star when neither sun nor moon is out. It's a common ingredient in love mixtures and protective spells. A crown of vervain on the head protects a magician while invoking spirits. Any part of the plant may be carried as a personal amulet. Vervain placed in the home protects it from lightning and storms. An infusion sprinkled around the premises chases off evil spirits and malignant forces. It's also added into exorcism incenses and sprinkling mixtures, and a common ingredient in purification bath sachets. It is also used in healing workings, though sadly it is mostly well known now as being the protective plant against vampires in the Vampire Diaries. Though don't expect it to burn a vampire's skin if they touch it. That one very much does belong in fantasy. Finally, we have Dittany of Crete. This is closely associated with the element of water as well as the planet Venus, which makes perfect sense as to why it is incorporated so closely into love spells. And it is primarily used for manifestation and astral projection. When burned, it's an excellent base for manifestations of spirits. The wraiths appear in the smoke rising from the censer. It's also mixed with equal parts of vanilla, benzoin, and sandalwood to make an astral projection incense. Burn a small amount prior to making an astral projection attempt. But for me, I think that this one is associated with love because of the Venus and the water associations. And this then comes back to a video that I posted. It might be last week as you're watching this, the one about advancing your magical practice. Ask the why. You see that vervain and Dittany of Crete are used in these kind of workings. Going through a reference book like this is really, really helpful. I can see that this is associated with Venus and water, which makes a lot of sense for this kind of emotional romance that we're working with. Vervain is also associated with the planet Venus and the element Earth, so we have that same Venus energy again. Let's check the elder. elder is also associated with the planet Venus and the element water. Rose petals, I believe, is also associated with the element water because of its emotional qualities. But I will do my due diligence. Wow, due diligence. Due diligence. That is a tongue twister. But I will do my due diligence and I will check anyway just to make sure I'm not remembering that wrong. And then I know that henbane is associated with the water element. Let's check juniper berries. And then juniper berries are associated with fire. But as we can see there, the majority of those plants that are going into this are water element and Venus planet. And so a lot of the time, if you know the planetary association and the elemental association of a particular plant, that goes a long way to then figuring out the different ways that you can use it in spells and rituals. We then see her go on to cast this love spell. The last portion of the particular spell sheet or the spell paper is obscured, but it does mention being naked and focusing on your intention. Now, I will say, do not ever, under any circumstances, please drink something like this. Henbane is so unbelievably dangerous that this could not only potentially lead you to being in hospital, but you might never see the inside of the hospital. So please don't ever be drinking anything like this unless you 1,000% know what you're doing. And I'll be honest, the majority of people don't know what they're doing. Now, she begins by drinking from this chalice and calling upon the goddess. Now, she is lying or sitting at this point on a pentacle rug, cloth, whatever it might be. She's then calling upon the goddess and chanting what it is that she wants to achieve whilst lying mostly sky-clad inside this pentacle. Now, this has been set up in a very specific way, and there are 4 candles that represent the 4 elements, and they are placed in actually the correct directions. I'm glad that they got it right. So we have a red candle to represent the fire element in the south, we have a green candle to represent the earth element in the north, we have a yellow candle to represent the air element in the east, and we have a blue candle to represent the water element in the west. Now, this is a very different colour direction to what we see in other traditions. In traditional witchcraft, for instance, the colours are different and the directions are different. For me, this is what I was taught because I followed a traditional British path for a long time within Wicca. So this is the way that I always do it. This is going to vary depending on where you are in the world, the kind of tradition that you follow, whether you're Wiccan, whether you just practice witchcraft, traditional witchcraft or modern witchcraft. The list goes on, but for this particular movie, it makes total sense for this to be the layout. Now, at this point, we see Elaine going into the apothecary where they greet each other by saying bright blessings. These are terms that are very commonly used. Bright blessings, blessed be, are really common interactions. And it's also used as a way of identifying other practitioners. If you were to say blessed be to someone and they say blessed be back again, or if you were to say bright blessings to them and they would say bright blessings to you back, then you're aware that both of you are practitioners in that setting. Now, this isn't done so much today. You will still see it during coven ceremony. So you might, upon entering or leaving a coven environment, be saying bright blessings and blessed be and the like. It's commonly used as well during ceremony and ritual. Maybe not so much in daily life now, but then now we have other ways of acknowledging other people are practitioners. We can put it on social media, we can talk about it more openly, we can wear jewelry and the like without it being a crime, because when this movie is set, it isn't a crime. When something like Gerald Gardner's High Magic's Aid was published in 1949, it was still a crime to practice witchcraft in England till the early 1950s, and so a lot of stuff had to be done under great secrecy. Now, this is where we start seeing it getting more horror-based. Hello from the future. I have just finished filming this video, and it's absolutely massive. It's going to be a beast. So I've actually decided to split this into 2 parts. I'm really sorry about that, but I just realized that there was no way that my editing software could cope with doing it all as one video, and I think a 2.5 hour long video might have been a bit much for most people. I say that knowing that some of you will sit through my 5-6 hour live streams, but still, I think this is just going to be more easily digestible. So tune in a couple of days for the next part, and I hope you enjoy this section. If you did enjoy this video, feel free to give it a like. If you've got any questions or comments, feel free to post them in the comment section, and if you do enjoy the magical content on this channel or in this video, feel free to hit subscribe. I try to post magical content every single week. And I'm going to be very glad to get Elaine's look off me. The blue eyeshadow with the orange lipstick isn't really my vibe, but you know what? I committed to the bit and we're here. So I'm going to go take this off. and look at something that isn't a camera and a filming light, because I've been here for a very long time. I hope you're staying safe. I hope you have a marvelous, magical day, and I will see you in the next video.